Okay, so this is the second page of the Chapter 5 test review. So number 6, it tells us f of x is a negative 2x to the 1/3 and g of x is 5x to the 1/2. And it wants us to add the functions together, subtract the functions, multiply functions, and divide. And then state the domain of each and then evaluate when x is 5, rounding to the nearest hundredth. So let's just start with the function f plus the function g. So I'm going to add them together, which is taking the negative 2x to the 1/3 plus 5x to the 1/2 and simplifying if we can. But in this case, we cannot. Our x to the powers are different. One is to the 1/3 power, one is to the 1/2 power. We can't add that together unless they're the same. So that is f plus g of x. Then it wants the domain. If you were to graph this in your calculator, if you're not sure what it's supposed to look like, that one x to the 1/2 should give it away. Kind of looks like an eyebrow. It's going to start at 0, whoops, but it can equal 0, and then it goes to infinity. All right, and then if you plug in 5, it wants f plus g when x is 5. You plug that in your equation. You plug that 5 in and just type all that in your calculator or do the math yourself, but you're going to get decimals. So, and then round to the nearest hundredth, which is 2 decimal places. I got 7.76. So be careful when you're rounding that you are rounding that last number where it's supposed to go, okay? If it's 5 or higher, round up. If it's 0 to 4, don't round up. So, all right, so now we want to do f minus g of x. So if I write my f of x, and I'm going to subtract my g of x. Now, if this had multiple terms like a plus, you would want it in parentheses and distribute that negative or that minus, but this is just one term, so I don't need that. They do not have the same power, so I cannot add them to or subtract them and simplify that anymore. And its domain is the same. It's going to go from 0 to infinity. If you were unsure about that, graph it in your calculator on Desmos and check it out. And then this was f minus g. That's what I found up here. But it wants it when x is 5. So you plug in everywhere you had an x. You plug in that 5. And I just typed all that in my calculator, and I get negative 14.60. I do add that 0 there because it keeps going after that. I am rounding. I am stopping it at the hundredths places, which is what the problem asks for. Then it wants f of g of x. I'm sorry, it doesn't want f of g of x. It wants f times g of x. There we go, if I say it correctly. So I'm going to take the negative 2x to the 1/3, and I'm going to multiply it by the 5x to the 1/2. Okay, so I multiply the whole numbers. I multiply the negative 2 and 5. I get negative 10. And when we multiply x to the powers, we add their powers. So it's going to end up being x to the 5/6. Okay, so there is f times g of x. If I were to graph that, my domain is from 0 to infinity. It's going to have an even root, so that's how I know it's going to start at that 0, doesn't move left or right. But the even root tells me it's not going to go negative. And then I want when I have f times g when x is 5. So I plug in my negative 10 times 5 to the 5/6, and I get a negative 38.24. All right, f divided by g of x is going to have a negative 2x to the 1/3 divided by 5x to the 1/2. Well, the negative 2 and 5 don't simplify pretty, so we're going to leave those alone. My bigger power is in the denominator. It's the 1/2 power. So I'm going to take 1/2 and I'm going to subtract the 1/3, and I end up with 1/6. And then that's as simplified as that's going to get. My domain for this one is 0 to infinity. And then if I take f divided by g of 5, I'm plugging in 5 for that x, I get a problem that looks like this. And I got a negative 0.31. All right, number 7, it wants us to find the inverse of the f of x and then graph f of x and its inverse. Well, let's first just graph, I'm just going to graph the function it gave us, f of x. So it's y equals mx plus b, so my intercept is negative 4. My slope is 2, so I'm going to go right 1 up 2, or up 2 right 1, however you want to think of that. All right. Oops, I'm on an iPad, hard to make it exact. And for inverses, I know if I have the line, it's really hard to draw this straight on the iPad, but there we go. If I were to have this imaginary line, this line's not really there, you don't need to draw it, I'm just showing you. If I have the line y equals x, it is if f of x is reflected across that line, that is my inverse, okay? So I'm going to leave my red line there just to show you, but you don't need that line there. Actually, no, I'll take it off. I'll show it to you in a minute after we find the inverse. So for f of x being 2x minus 4, I'm going to write what's happening to x. Starting closest to x, it is being multiplied by 2. And then it's subtract 4. Okay, so that's what's happening. And then if I work backwards, so now my number 1 is going to be the opposite of the number 2, and my number 2 is the opposite of number 1. So opposite of subtracting 4 would be add 4. And the opposite of multiply 2, would be divide 2. All right, so when I write my inverse, I have x. The first step here is add 4 to it. The second step says divide by 2, which means divide everything I have written so far and divide it by 2. Okay? So you writing an inverse like this is correct. When graphing it, it is a little easier if I go ahead and divide the x by 2 and divide the 4 by 2. Okay, so both of these answers are actually correct. But when graphing it, that bottom one is a little easier. So if I go to graph it, I know my y-intercept is at 2. My slope is up 1, right 2. And I draw my graph. Whoops, it's not letting me draw that from that end. Okay, now see, remember that red line that I told you? Here, I'll do it kind of dashed. It doesn't let me do it very lightly, but okay, those lines are reflected across that. And since they do look like I drew them correctly, like they are reflected across, I do know those are inverses of each other. So that's a way to check yourself. If you draw that line, y equals x, and they do not look like they are reflections across that, you may have made a mistake. So always list, what I do is I list what's happening closest to x, which in this case, closest to x would be the multiplying by 2, and then it has a minus 4. So I list those as 1 to 2, and then I go backwards, starting at the bottom, and I work my way up. And that's what I do to x to get the inverse. Okay, so this is page 2 of the Chapter 5 review. There will be another video for page 3.